Every Halloween, certain monsters rise out of the shadows to take center stage, and none loom larger than the vampire. From haunted castles to blood-soaked battlefields, they've stalked their way into comics for decades. And this year, as part of Tales from the Longbox's Halloween special, I'm sinking my teeth into their history. From Marvel's legendary Tomb of Dracula, to Morbius the Living Vampire, to DC's Andrew Bennett, and even Batman's bloody Elseworlds transformation. These aren't just cheap horror knockoffs, they're some of the darkest, strangest, and most enduring stories ever told in comics. And along the way, I'll even shine a light on a few of the terrifying vampires outside the big two. So grab your garlic, sharpen your steaks, let's open the coffin on some of the best vampire stories in all of comics. Vampires in comics. When Marvel launched The Tomb of Dracula in 1972, it wasn't just adding another horror title, it was redefining how vampires could work in comics. Running for 70 issues until 1979, the series became one of the most iconic horror runs in Marvel history. It followed a group of vampire hunters as they fought Count Dracula and other supernatural threats, blending gothic horror with serialized drama. Dracula was more than just a monster, he was a recurring supervillain. Crossed paths with the heroes like Blade the Vampire Slayer, Spider-Man, the Werewolf, the X-Men, Howard the Duck, and Solomon Kane. Part of what made the Tomb of Dracula so influential was how it came about. In 1971, the Comics Code Authority relaxed its strict ban on vampires, a rule that existed for decades. Marvel seized the opportunity to launch a regular vampire series, choosing Dracula because of his cultural recognition and because Bram Stoker's creation was of course in the public domain. This decision opened the door for deeper exploration of vampire mythology and comics, and the Tomb of Dracula became a proving ground for that exploration. The series began with some instability, with different writers trying to find the right direction, but it found its stride when Marv Wolfman took over as scripter. His collaboration with Gene Colan defined the tone of the series, a rich mix of gothic dread, layered character drama, and long-running arcs. Dracula is an enduring character with complex relationships, especially with the band of vampire hunters led by Quincy Harker and later Rachel Van Helsing. These hunters, including Blade, Frank Drake, and Hannibal King, brought humanity, tragedy, and moral complexity to the vampire genre. Over its run, the Tomb of Dracula expanded Dracula's world, weaving in crossovers like Werewolf by Night and Doctor Strange, and creating a sprawling mythos that continues to influence vampire stories in comics today. Even decades later, Dracula has remained a potent figure, appearing in later miniseries, crossovers, and reinterpretations, including Dracula, Lord of the Undead, The Curse of Dracula, and appearances in Night Stalker and Blade. While the Tomb of Dracula defined Marvel's vampire legacy, DC Comics took a very different approach with its own dark entry to the genre. First appearing in 1981, I, Vampire offered a new kind of vampire story, blending gothic horror with superhero drama, centered on Andrew Bennett, a 400-year-old vampire who resists feeding on humans. The series explored redemption, morality, and survival in a world filled with monsters. Bennett wasn't just a predator, he was a vampire who fought against his own kind, becoming both a hunter and protector. This gave the series a unique angle, making it as much of a tale of moral struggle as it was of supernatural horror. I, Vampire began in the House of Mystery before receiving its own title, and over time became a cult favorite for DC fans. The series developed a deep mythology and rich supporting cast, with Bennett's story expanding through reboots and crossovers over the years. Where the Tomb of Dracula focused on gothic menace and sprawling vampire mythology, I, Vampire offered a deeply personal narrative. A vampire haunted not just by enemies, but by centuries of guilt, loss, and the question of whether a monster can be redeemed. Together, these series show that vampire comics can be more than just the horror cliches. It can be explorations of identity, morality, and the endless struggle between darkness and light. Blade, the vampire who became legend. Blade isn't just another Marvel hero. He is one of the most culturally significant characters the company has ever created. He stands as a bridge between genres, a character who redefined what a comic book hero could be. Part horror, part action icon, and part myth. His importance comes not only from his comic prowess or longevity, but from his concept. A vampire who refuses his curse and turns it into his weapon. Born Eric Brooks, Blade's life began in tragedy. His mother was bitten by a vampire during childbirth, and that bite left him both cursed and gifted. He became a Dhampir, half human, half vampire, with immunity to the weaknesses of the undead. While possessing their superhuman strength, speed, stamina, agility, heightened senses, and rapid healing, he also retained his humanity, the one thing vampires lose. This duality is what makes Blade unique. A vampire who walks in the daylight, who resists the hunger that drives his kind, and who has devoted his life to eradicating the very species he belongs to. That inner conflict is central to Blade's appeal. He isn't just fighting vampires, he's also fighting himself. His vampirism gives him power, but it also gives him an eternal burden. Every stake driven into a monster is a fight to suppress his own darkness. That makes him a little more than a hunter, it makes him a living symbol of resistance. His combat skills are legendary. Trained by Jamal Afari in vampire lore and martial arts, Blade became a master of boxing, capoeira, eskrima, jiu-jitsu, ninjutsu, and swordmanship. His arsenal, teakwood stakes, silver blades, UV grenades, and his iconic double-edged sword, evolved into an extension of his mission to eradicate vampires by any means necessary. Blade's impact reached far beyond the page. Wesley Snipes' portrayal in the late 1990s elevated him into a cultural icon, delivering a trilogy of films that blended horror and superhero storytelling in a way that had never been done before. Blade became proof that comic book heroes could defy convention, paving the way for modern superheroes' cinematic era. His popularity cemented him as one of Marvel's most important characters, a rare hero whose identity is inseparable from his condition. As Marvel reintroduces Blade to a new generation with Mahershala Ali, his relevance has never been greater. Blade's story is a reminder that vampirism in fiction is more than a curse, it is a choice. Blade chose to turn his curse into a mission, his darkness into a weapon, and his humanity into a legend. That's why Blade isn't just a vampire, he is the Daywalker. He is a hero, and he is one of Marvel's most enduring icons. Superheroes meet vampires when horror crosses capes. Blade's existence proved that vampires could work within storytelling, not as distant monsters lurking in gothic shadows, but as a direct personal threat to heroes themselves. Once that seed was planted, comics began exploring the terrifying what if. What happens when a hero becomes the monster? This question has driven some of the most unforgettable vampire stories in comics, transforming vampirism into a narrative crucible for tragedy, temptation, and moral conflict. It is here that vampire myths meet superhero drama, where the stakes aren't just about saving the city, but saving oneself from the darkness within. Marvel answered this question first with Michael Morbius, debuting in Amazing Spider-Man number 101 in 1971, from Roy Thomas and Gil Kane. Unlike Blade's supernatural curse, Morbius became a vampire through science. Experiment gone wrong. His vampirism is a blend of tragedy and horror. He possesses many vampiric traits: thirst for blood, enhanced strength, speed, healing, and senses, but his origin is rooted in science rather than gothic mystique. That makes Morbius one of the first science vampires, and a perfect example of how Marvel blended horror with superheroics. Morbius' storylines often explore the duality of his conditions, fighting villains while fighting himself. DC Comics brought vampirism to one of its most iconic heroes with Batman Red Rain in 1991, written by Doug Moench and illustrated by Kelly Jones. In this Elseworlds tale, Batman succumbs to vampirism, trading his humanity to gain the strength to confront Dracula. The trilogy that followed was steeped in gothic horror, turning Gotham into a vampire nightmare. For Batman, vampirism isn't just a curse, it's a thematic extension of his war on darkness, pushing his moral boundaries and adding a supernatural edge to his vigilantism. Back in Marvel's world, vampirism became a tool for storytelling on a larger scale. Characters like Jubilee transform into a vampire in X-Men, and Storm's history with Dracula gave vampires a direct influence on hero teams. For mutants already grappling with identity and difference, vampirism became an extra layer of tragedy and temptation. It forced them to confront what it means to lose control and how far they'll go to protect what humanity they have. Across these stories, vampirism is never just a physical change. The dramatic transformation reshapes character arcs. Heroes wrestle with new weaknesses, monstrous cravings, and moral dilemmas. It is a shift that turns the vampires from a shadowy villain into an intimate personal threat, sometimes even the hero's own reflection. This evolution of vampire storytelling, from Blade's personal war to full-scale vampiric transformation of superheroes, set the stage for the next chapter in comic book horror: the rise of vampire armies and blood wars. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, vampire stories and comics had evolved beyond lone hunters or gothic tragedies. Both Marvel and DC began exploring the idea of vampires as armies, organized ideological forces capable of threatening entire worlds. Vampirism became less about isolated horror and more about apocalyptic war. On DC's side, Mary, Queen of Blood, and the Blood Red Moon Cult turned vampirism into a mystical army with its own religion and apocalyptic vision. Beginning in House of Mystery number 290, Mary gathered vampire warriors across the globe under her banner. Her story transformed vampires from singular predators into a cult-like force, blending mythology, ritual, and large-scale war. This idea expanded in later arcs, where vampiric armies became a recurring threat in DC's supernatural storytelling, proving vampires could be a geopolitical and even metaphysical danger rather than just gothic monsters. Marvel's 2010-2011 storyline, Curse of the Mutants, took this concept to new heights. Dracula led an unprecedented vampire uprising, transforming vampirism into a literal plague. Entire cities fell, and iconic heroes were turned into soldiers for Dracula's army. Vampires were no longer scattered predators. They became a force capable of overwhelming even the greatest defenders of the Marvel Universe. Curse of the Mutants cemented the idea that vampires could operate as organized military threats on a scale akin to superhero wars. That concept became central in Marvel's most recent vampire event, Bloodhunt, in 2024, arguably the boldest vampire war in decades. In a shocking twist, Blade, the ultimate vampire hunter, became the commander of a vampire army under possession by Varney, the first vampire. Blade was transformed into both general and weapon, leading the Blood Coven against humanity. Across sprawling battles, Blade's army attacked key strongholds in the Marvel Universe, including the Impossible City and even the Sanctum Sanctorum. These battles were not random raids, they were a calculated war of conquest. Blade's possession and leadership brought chilling weight to the story, turning him into a tragic figure. The man who had devoted his life to destroying vampires, now commanding them as their greatest champion. The climax of Bloodhunt saw Blade finally breaking Varney's control, but not without immense cost. Arc left lasting changes in Marvel's vampire mythos. Vampirism was no longer a scattered curse, but a potential army capable of world conquest, and Blade's name became synonymous with both the greatest vampire hunter and one of vampirism's most powerful generals. These vampire army arcs redefined the stake for supernatural comics. Vampires ceased to be just gothic monsters lurking in shadowed alleys. They became ideological armies, apocalyptic movements, and forces of war that could change entire universes. From Mary, Queen of Blood's cult, to Dracula's legion in Curse of the Mutants, and Blade's tragic command in Bloodhunt, modern comics have turned vampires into a threat on an epic scale. This transformation redefined vampire storytelling. No longer confined to personal horror, vampires in comics have become symbols of existential war, a force that can unite heroes, challenge morality, and forever change the landscape of their worlds. Modern horror vampires outside the big two. While Marvel and DC built vampire epics with armies, cults, and crossover wars, independent creators took vampirism in a different direction, blending horror, history, and reinvention in ways that redefined the genre for modern readers. These stories stripped away the superhero framework, treating vampires as not as foot soldiers in grand war, but as a primal forces of fear, desire, and survival. 30 Days of Night. Created by Steve Niles and Ben Templesmith in 2002, 30 Days of Night transformed vampire storytelling into a survival horror nightmare. Set in Barrow, Alaska, town plunged into a month of perpetual darkness each winter. The series leaned heavily into atmosphere. Vampires were no gothic aristocrats or reluctant heroes. They were feral predators, relentless killers who turned darkness into their hunting ground. The story's brilliance lay in how it merged vampire mythos with environmental horror. By removing the light entirely, 30 Days of Night made the traditional weakness of vampires irrelevant. Here, vampirism was no longer about tragic romance or seductive horror. It became a pure, unrelenting fight for survival. The success of 30 Days of Night led to a film adaptation, a sequel series, and a lasting influence on modern vampire horror. American Vampire. Written by Scott Snyder with art by Raphael Albuquerque, the American Vampire reimagined the vampire mythos as a generational saga. The series blends horror with history, following different vampires across eras, from the Wild West to modern day. Its unique hook is the introduction of a new species of vampire, one immune to sunlight, born in America. The central character, Skinner Sweet, embodies this reinvention. He is a predator shaped by the American landscape, violent, pragmatic, and deeply tied to the era he inhabits. American Vampire is much a meditation of the evolution of vampirism, as it is a thrilling horror epic. It treats vampires not as static monsters, but as entities evolving alongside human history, capable of embodying the fears of any era. Outside of mainstream superhero comics, independent creators have been free to push vampirism into experimental territory. Indies treat vampires as a metaphor, horror, romance, or socio-political commentary, rather than merely supernatural villains. Titles like Vampire State Building, Real World Vampire Tales, and countless self-published works have expanded what vampires can be in comics. Reflections of identity, cultural fear, power, and transformation. These indie works show that vampire mythos is endlessly adaptable. Whether as a haunting allegory, supernatural warlord, or an intimate tale of survival, the vampire continues to inspire creators who see them as more than just monsters, as mirrors of human nature itself. From the gothic halls of Tomb of Dracula to the brutal streets of Bloodhunt, vampires in comics have never been static. They've evolved, from shadowy monsters to complex forces, tragic figures, seductive predators, armies of the damned, and even reluctant heroes. Characters like Blade have taken the evolution further, becoming icons not only because of their power, but because of how they bridge genres, blending horror, action, and mythology in a way few other characters have managed. Blade proved that vampire stories could survive in the superhero world, turning his war into a defining moment for both vampire storytelling and comic book history. Meanwhile, events like Bloodhunt and Curse of the Mutants show how vampires in mainstream comics can become existential threats, reshaping entire universes. And indie works like 30 Days of Night and American Vampire remind us that the vampire mythos is endlessly flexible, able to reflect the fears of any era, whether in high-octane war or quiet, intimate terror. Vampires endure because they are mirrors of human nature, embodying fear, desire, power, and morality. Whether they stalk the dark alleys of New York, wage war across dimensions, or haunt the pages of an indie horror epic, vampires remain one of the richest veins of storytelling in comics. And since this is just part of my Halloween special, beware. The darkness doesn't stop here. In my next video, I'll be sinking my teeth into the most chilling curses in comic book history. Personal tragedies and world-shattering afflictions that prove the supernatural is one of the best tools for storytelling. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one.